Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories that matter. Here we tell powerful, emotional stories about truth, injustice, resilience, and the strength of ordinary people facing extraordinary trials. The death of Nathan Carter came suddenly, with the kind of finality that leaves no room for preparation or farewell. One day he was a presence rooted in the land his family had owned for generations, a man whose name carried weight across the rolling acres of Montana ranch country, and the next day he was gone, leaving behind silence, unanswered plans, and a family fractured in ways no one openly acknowledged at the funeral. The service was held in the small-town church not far from the ranch. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where surnames carried histories longer than the roads that led through the valley. People filled the pews out of habit, respect, or obligation. Some came to honor Nathan, others to witness what would happen next. Emily Carter stood near the front, dressed simply, her hands clasped tightly around those of her young son Liam, who did not yet understand why his father lay still in a polished wooden casket, or why so many adults spoke in hushed voices around him. Emily's grief was heavy but quiet. She had cried in private, in the long hours after the accident and in the nights that followed, when sleep refused to come. Now, surrounded by people and expectations, she felt hollow rather than broken, as though the world had shifted slightly off balance and she alone noticed. Liam leaned against her, sensing her tension without understanding its cause. She focused on him, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, because focusing on anything else threatened to unravel her completely. Richard and Evelyn Carter sat several rows behind her. Nathan's parents had arrived early and taken their places with the calm assurance of people accustomed to being observed. Richard was known throughout the county as a man of authority, someone who had expanded the family ranch from a modest operation into a profitable enterprise. Evelyn carried herself with a composure that suggested both refinement and distance. Together they embodied the Carter legacy, a legacy that had shaped Nathan's life long before Emily had entered it. After the burial, the mourners gathered briefly outside the church. Words of sympathy were exchanged, hands were shaken, and condolences were offered in voices practiced for such occasions. Emily thanked people politely, though she remembered few of their faces afterward. What she did remember was the moment Richard approached her, his expression unreadable, and informed her that she should come to the ranch later that afternoon. There were matters that needed to be discussed, he said. Family matters. Emily nodded, assuming that this was about arrangements, about how she and Liam would move forward now that Nathan was gone. Despite the stiffness she had sometimes felt around her in-laws during her marriage, she believed that shared loss might soften old boundaries. Nathan had been their only child. Surely they would want to ensure that his wife and son were cared for. The ranch house loomed large against the horizon when Emily arrived later that day. It had always felt imposing to her, even during happier times, with its wide porch, heavy beams, and rooms filled with the accumulated wealth of generations. Nathan had grown up here, had learned to ride horses and manage land under his father's watchful eye. Emily had moved in after their marriage but had never truly felt that the house belonged to her. She was led into the main living room, where Richard and Evelyn sat waiting. Papers were arranged neatly on the table between them. The atmosphere was formal, stripped of any warmth the day's shared grief might have suggested. Emily sat opposite them, Liam perched beside her, swinging his legs idly. Richard spoke first. He explained that Nathan had left a will. The wording was precise, his tone businesslike. According to the document, the ranch, its land, livestock, equipment, and all associated assets were to remain under the control of Richard and Evelyn Carter. Emily listened carefully, her confusion growing with each sentence. She waited for the part where Nathan provided for his wife and child, certain it must be there somewhere, perhaps in language she did not yet understand. Instead, Richard concluded by stating that Emily and Liam would be given use of an old house on the far edge of the property. It was a structure that had once served as housing for ranch hands decades earlier and had long since fallen into disrepair. It would be theirs, he said, if they wished to stay. Otherwise, they were free to make other arrangements. For a moment, Emily could not process what she was hearing. The words seemed disconnected from reality, as though spoken in another language. She thought of conversations she had had with Nathan about the future, about ensuring stability for Liam, about his intentions to formalize everything legally. She had trusted that he would protect them, just as she had trusted that his parents would not abandon their grandson. She asked to see the will. Evelyn intervened before Richard could respond, stating that there was no need. Everything had been handled properly, she said, and the document was legally registered. There was nothing to dispute. Her voice was calm, almost kind, but there was an unmistakable finality beneath it. Emily felt a flush of humiliation rise in her chest. She realized then that this meeting was not a discussion but a verdict. Richard made it clear that challenging the will would be unwise. Legal battles were expensive and exhausting, and Emily had neither the means nor the support to pursue one. Accepting what she was offered, he implied, was the sensible choice. Liam grew restless beside her, sensing the tension. Emily placed a hand on his back, grounding herself in the simple, familiar act of comforting her child. She wanted to argue, to demand explanations, to remind them that Nathan had loved his son and would never have chosen to leave him vulnerable. But the room felt heavy with power she did not possess, and every instinct told her that resistance would only make things worse. She asked how soon they needed to move. Evelyn answered that their belongings had already been transferred to the smaller house. The decision had been made, and it was effective immediately. Emily stood slowly, lifting Liam into her arms. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply acknowledged the reality placed before her. As she walked toward the door, Richard added a final warning, advising her not to create trouble or attempt to question the arrangement. Gratitude, he suggested, would serve her better than defiance. Outside, the air felt colder than it had earlier in the day. Emily paused briefly on the porch, looking back at the house that had once represented security and family. She understood now that those things had been conditional, tied not to love or loyalty, but to control. Whatever she and Liam were going to have in the future, they would have to claim it on their own. The drive to the far edge of the property was quiet. The smaller house came into view slowly, its weathered structure standing alone against the open land. It was worse than Emily had imagined, with uneven floors, aging walls, and an unmistakable sense of neglect. This, she realized, was not just a place to live. It was a statement. As she stepped inside with Liam, the door closing behind them, Emily felt the full weight of her new reality settle in. She had lost her husband, her home, and her place within the Carter family in the span of a single day. What remained was uncertainty, a child who depended on her completely, and a quiet resolve beginning to take shape beneath her grief. She did not yet know how she would survive or what path lay ahead. But as night fell over the ranch and the lights of the main house glowed faintly in the distance, Emily understood one thing with absolute clarity. The life she had known was over, and whatever came next would begin here, in this forgotten corner of land where she had been sent to disappear. The first night in the small house passed without sleep. Emily lay awake on the narrow bed that had been moved there from the main ranch house, along with the rest of their belongings. The familiar furniture looked strange in the dim, uneven light, as if it no longer belonged to the life it had come from. Wind slipped through unseen cracks, carrying with it the sounds of the open land, distant animals, and the faint hum of activity far away, where the Carter ranch continued to function without her. Liam slept beside her, curled tightly, his small hand gripping the fabric of her sleeve, as though afraid she might disappear if he let go. When morning came, it did not bring clarity or comfort. Sunlight revealed the true condition of the house. The floors were uneven and worn thin in places. Dust coated every surface despite the hurried cleaning that must have been done before their arrival. The plumbing worked only sporadically, and the kitchen held little more than bare cabinets and an aging stove that looked as though it might fail at any moment. Emily moved through the space slowly, taking inventory not just of the house, but of her situation. This was no temporary shelter. This was where she and her son were expected to rebuild their lives. She began by doing what she could control. She unpacked their clothes, arranged Liam's few toys, and scrubbed the counters until her hands ached. Cleaning became a way to think, to process the shock of what had happened. With each task, she reminded herself that despair would not feed her child or keep a roof over his head. Whatever bitterness she felt toward Richard and Evelyn Carter would have to wait. Survival came first, Money was the next problem. Emily had some savings, but they were modest and would not last long. She needed work, and quickly. Within days, she began walking to the nearest town, a long trek that left her exhausted by the time she arrived. She asked at grocery stores, small businesses, anywhere that might need help. Her experience was limited, but she was willing to learn. Eventually, she found part-time work assisting at a local shop. The pay barely enough to cover food and basic supplies. Still, it was something, and she accepted it without hesitation. Each day followed a strict routine. She woke early, prepared simple meals, and walked Liam to a neighbor who agreed to watch him while she worked. Evenings were spent repairing what she could in the house. She patched cracks, reinforced loose boards, and learned to live with inconvenience. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, when the weight of loss pressed so heavily that breathing felt difficult. But she pushed forward, driven by the quiet determination that had begun to replace her initial shock. Weeks passed. The house slowly became more livable, though it never lost its sense of isolation. Emily noticed how the land around it felt separate from the rest of the ranch, as if deliberately forgotten. She understood now that the choice of this house had not been random. It was meant to remind her of her place, or rather, of her lack of one. One afternoon, after a particularly heavy rain, Emily noticed dampness creeping up from the floor near one corner of the main room. Concerned about mold and further damage, she decided to address it before it became worse. With limited tools, she pried up a section of the old wooden flooring, revealing packed earth beneath. As she worked, something hard resisted her efforts. At first, she assumed it was a stone, but the sound it made was unmistakably metallic. Curiosity overcame fatigue. She cleared away more dirt, her movements growing more careful as the object took shape. It was a small metal container, worn and rusted, yet intact. Emily froze for a moment, uncertain whether she should disturb it. The house held the weight of the past, and she had learned quickly that not everything buried should be uncovered. But necessity and instinct urged her forward. She lifted the container onto the table and wiped away years of grime. The lid resisted at first, as though reluctant to release what it protected. When it finally opened, Emily felt her breath catch. Inside were papers, carefully wrapped and preserved despite their hiding place. She recognized Nathan's handwriting immediately, even before she unfolded the letter resting on top. The letter was addressed to her. Her hands trembled as she read, absorbing each word slowly, afraid that moving too fast might break the fragile connection it created. Nathan explained his fears, his distrust, and his decision to hide the documents where he believed they would be safe. He wrote of his love for her and for Liam, of his determination to secure their future, even if he could not be there to protect them himself. Beneath the letter lay the will. Emily read it twice, then a third time, scarcely believing what she saw. The language was clear and unambiguous. Nathan had left everything to her and their son. The ranch, the land, all of it belonged to them. The betrayal she had endured was not just emotional, but legal, deliberate, and calculated. For a long time, Emily sat in silence. The papers spread out before her. Tears came, but they were different from those she had shed before. These were not tears of helpless grief, but of release and realization. Nathan had not abandoned them. He had anticipated exactly what would happen and had trusted her to find the truth. As evening approached, Emily carefully repacked the documents, placing them somewhere safe. The house no longer felt like a prison or an insult. It felt like a threshold. What had been meant as a place of exile had become the starting point of something else entirely. That night, as Liam slept peacefully, Emily lay awake again. But this time her thoughts were focused and clear. Fear still lingered, but it was tempered by purpose. She understood the risks ahead, the power she would be challenging, and the uncertainty of the path forward. Yet she also understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. The next chapter of her life would not be about endurance alone. It would be about truth, and the quiet, steady resolve to see it recognized. The discovery of the hidden documents changed everything, yet it did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it introduced a new weight into Emily's life, one far heavier than uncertainty. Truth, once uncovered, demanded action, and action carried risks she could no longer ignore. The small house no longer felt merely isolated. It felt watched, as though the land itself were aware that something had shifted beneath its surface. For several days, Emily did nothing beyond her usual routine. She went to work, cared for Liam, and returned each evening to the quiet edge of the ranch. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, every thought revolved around the papers hidden beneath a loose floorboard, their presence both a comfort and a source of fear. She knew that confronting Richard and Evelyn directly would be useless. Whatever they had been done deliberately and with confidence. They believed she had no proof, no allies, and no strength to oppose them. What she needed was guidance. She needed someone who understood the law and was not bound by the influence the Carter name still held across the county. That realization marked the beginning of a careful, cautious search. Emily began asking discreet questions in town, choosing her moments and her words with care. She did not mention wills or fraud. She simply asked if anyone knew of a lawyer who was honest, someone who valued principle over reputation. The responses were discouraging. Some names were offered and then quickly withdrawn, accompanied by warnings spoken in lowered voices. The Carters, she was told, were not people to challenge lightly. Their connections reached further than most outsiders realized. Others suggested that fighting them would only prolong her suffering and drain what little stability she had managed to create for herself and her son. Emily listened, thanked them, and continued searching. Each refusal tested her resolve, but she reminded herself why she could not stop. The documents existed. The truth existed. Ignoring it would mean accepting a lie that would shape Liam's entire future. Eventually, one name surfaced more than once, always accompanied by hesitation, but never outright dismissal. The lawyer was elderly, long retired, and lived quietly near the edge of town. He had a reputation for integrity that had survived decades of legal practice. People said he helped when he believed something truly mattered, though he rarely took cases anymore. Emily found his house one afternoon after work. It was modest and well kept, a reflection of a life lived without excess. Standing on the porch, she hesitated, aware that this moment might determine everything that followed. When the door opened, she was met with a man whose age showed in his posture, but not in his eyes. There was a steadiness there, a calm attention, that made her feel, for the first time since Nathan's death, that she might be seen rather than dismissed. She explained who she was and why she had come, speaking carefully, presenting facts rather than emotion. When she handed over the documents, her hands shook slightly, betraying the strain she had worked so hard to hide. The lawyer read in silence, his expression growing more serious with each page. Time seemed to stretch as Emily waited for his response, her thoughts racing through every possible outcome. When he finally spoke, his assessment was clear. The will was legitimate. The dates, the witnesses, the language all supported its validity. More importantly, it predated the document Richard and Evelyn had presented. The letter provided context and intent, reinforcing what the will already stated. What Emily held was not merely evidence. It was a direct contradiction of the narrative imposed upon her. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly tempered by the lawyer's caution. Possessing the truth and proving it were not the same thing. Richard Carter would not relinquish control willingly. If he had gone so far as to present a false will, he would not hesitate to defend it aggressively. The lawyer explained that they would need to examine the registered document, compare signatures, and identify any irregularities that could expose the forgery. The process began slowly and methodically. Records were requested. Dates were cross-referenced. Each small discovery added another piece to the puzzle. The lawyer's experience proved invaluable, allowing him to notice inconsistencies that others might overlook. The signature on the registered will, while convincing at a glance, lacked the natural fluidity present in Nathan's authentic handwriting. The pressure, the spacing, the subtle rhythm of the letters all suggested imitation rather than authorship. To strengthen their case, the lawyer consulted a handwriting expert, someone with no ties to the county and no reason to protect the Carter name. The analysis confirmed what suspicion had already suggested. The signature on the registered will was not genuine. It was a careful reproduction, but flawed in ways that only trained eyes could detect. As the investigation continued, another truth emerged, one that deepened the gravity of the situation. The false will had been registered by a local notary, known for bending rules when it suited him. Further inquiry revealed financial trouble and unexplained payments that coincided with the timing of Nathan's death. The pattern was clear, even if the full story had yet to be told. Throughout this process, Emily remained outwardly composed. She continued living in the small house, continued working, continued raising Liam, as though nothing extraordinary were happening. But inside, she felt herself changing. The woman who had walked out of the ranch house in silence was no longer the same. She was learning the language of resistance, not through anger, but through persistence. The lawyer prepared the legal challenge with care, ensuring that every claim was supported, every accusation grounded in evidence. When the papers were finally filed, the action felt both inevitable and terrifying. Emily knew that from this moment forward, there would be no retreat. The Carters would be notified. The quiet balance of power that had allowed her to exist unnoticed at the edge of the ranch would be shattered. As she returned home that evening, the land seemed different. The same wide fields stretched out before her, but now they carried the weight of conflict yet to come. The house no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like a foothold. Emily stood at the doorway, watching Liam play, and understood that whatever happened next would define more than a legal outcome. It would define the meaning of truth in a world shaped by influence and silence. And for the first time since Nathan's death, she felt not just determined, but prepared. The filing of the legal challenge altered the rhythm of life in the county almost immediately. News traveled quickly, carried not by official announcements, but by the quiet, persistent channels of observation and speculation that govern small communities. Emily sensed the shift before anyone spoke to her directly. Conversations paused when she entered rooms. Familiar faces regarded her with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and restrained judgment. Some admired her resolve in silence, while others considered her actions reckless, an unforgivable challenge to an established order that had gone unquestioned for decades. Richard Carter received the court summons with disbelief that quickly hardened into anger. For years, his authority had been absolute, enforced not only by wealth but by reputation. He had expected Emily to accept her assigned role and fade quietly from relevance. The challenge struck him as both an insult and a threat. He responded by retaining a prominent attorney, someone accustomed to defending powerful interests and dismantling opposition through pressure rather than persuasion. Emily learned of this indirectly through her lawyer, who did not conceal the seriousness of what lay ahead. The case would not be resolved quickly or gently. It would unfold under scrutiny, with each detail examined and contested. Every weakness would be exposed, every inconsistency exploited. Yet despite the warning, Emily felt no urge to withdraw. The point of no return had passed. What remained was endurance. The day the trial began, the courthouse was filled beyond capacity. Residents from neighboring towns arrived early, eager to witness what many already regarded as a defining moment. Emily entered quietly, dressed with deliberate simplicity, accompanied by her lawyer. She felt the weight of the room immediately, the collective attention pressing in from all sides. Yet beneath the anxiety, there was also clarity. She knew why she was there. She knew what she carried with her, both literally and in spirit. Across the room, Richard and Evelyn Carter sat beside their attorney, composed but tense. Their confidence was not entirely gone, but it was strained, reinforced now by legal strategy rather than certainty. The judge, known for a reputation built on impartiality rather than popularity, called the court to order, and the proceedings began. The opening arguments established the stark contrast between the two sides. Emily's lawyer presented the case not as a family dispute, but as a matter of legal integrity. He introduced the authentic will, the dates, the witnesses, and the accompanying letter that clarified Nathan's intent. The documents spoke plainly, requiring no embellishment. Their power lay in their precision. The opposing attorney responded with practiced confidence, questioning the circumstances of the discovery and suggesting opportunism. He implied that grief and desperation could lead people to reinterpret events in ways that served their interests. The suggestion hovered in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Emily remained still, refusing to react outwardly. She had expected this. Character, she understood, would be as much on trial as legality. The examination of evidence followed. The handwriting expert took the stand, methodically explaining the differences between the signatures. Enlarged comparisons were presented, each variation described with clinical certainty. The explanation was detailed and unyielding, leaving little room for interpretation. The expert's credentials were established, his neutrality emphasized. Attempts to undermine his conclusions faltered under the weight of consistency. Attention then turned to the registered will. Its timeline was scrutinized, its registration process dissected. Irregularities emerged clearly when placed alongside standard procedures. What had once seemed like an official record now appeared increasingly fragile, dependent on assumptions rather than proof. The most pivotal moment came with the involvement of the notary. When called to testify, his discomfort was evident even before he spoke. The questioning progressed carefully, beginning with routine confirmations and gradually tightening around specific details. Dates, payments, circumstances. The pressure mounted until evasion was no longer possible. The admission, when it came, was subdued but unmistakable. The registration had been improper. The document had not been authentic. Financial incentive had influenced judgment. The courtroom reacted with restrained shock, a ripple of realization passing through those present. The implication was unavoidable. This was not a misunderstanding or clerical error. It was fraud. Richard Carter's reaction was immediate and volatile, though swiftly contained by the authority of the court. His attorney attempted to redirect, to cast doubt, to suggest coercion or misrepresentation. But the foundation had already cracked. The truth, once exposed, did not require dramatic reinforcement. It stood on its own. Emily was given the opportunity to address the court. She spoke briefly, not from a place of accusation, but from one of clarity. She described Nathan's intentions as she understood them, not through sentiment, but through action. She spoke of responsibility, of inheritance not as privilege, but as trust. Her words were measured, her composure steady. The room listened. The judge recessed the court to deliberate. The pause felt interminable. Emily sat quietly, her hands folded, her thoughts fixed not on the outcome, but on the path that had brought her here. She had lived for months under the weight of uncertainty, and whatever the verdict, that chapter of her life was ending. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The decision was delivered without flourish. The registered will presented by Richard and Evelyn Carter was declared invalid. The evidence of forgery and improper registration was conclusive. The authentic will discovered by Emily was recognized as legally binding. Ownership of the ranch, its land, and all associated assets was transferred to Emily and her son. The ruling extended beyond inheritance, mandating further investigation into the fraudulent actions that had occurred. Richard and Evelyn were ordered to vacate the main house within a fixed period. The moment did not feel triumphant. Emily did not smile or cry. She simply closed her eyes for a brief second, absorbing the finality of the words. Justice, she realized, was quieter than she had imagined. It did not roar. It settled. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Emily stood and left with her lawyer, aware that the true work was not finished. A legal victory could restore property, but it could not erase loss or repair all damage. Still, as she stepped outside into the open air, she felt something she had not felt since Nathan's death. Balance. The land awaited her return, no longer as a place of exile, but as a responsibility reclaimed. What she chose to do next would define not only her future, but the meaning of the justice she had fought to achieve. Emily's return to the ranch did not resemble a victory march. There were no celebrations, no gathered crowd, no sense of conquest. Instead, it unfolded quietly, almost cautiously, as though the land itself were waiting to see what kind of owner she would become. The wide fields stretched out in the same way they always had, indifferent to court rulings and human conflict. Yet now they belonged to her and to Liam in a way they never truly had before. The main house stood open when she arrived, its familiar structure no longer intimidating, but heavy with memory. This was the place where she had once believed she was part of a family, where she had built routines and expectations that dissolved the moment Nathan died. Walking through its rooms again stirred conflicting emotions. She felt grief for what had been lost, relief for what had been reclaimed, and an unmistakable sense of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Richard and Evelyn Carter remained in the house during the mandated transition period, packing their belongings under the supervision of legal representatives. Their movements were stiff and restrained, stripped of the authority they had once exercised effortlessly. They avoided Emily when possible, and when they could not, their expressions revealed bitterness mixed with disbelief. The reality of their displacement had not yet settled fully, but its weight was beginning to show. Emily did not interfere. She did not gloat or comment. She focused instead on establishing control over the daily operations of the ranch. Records were reviewed, contracts examined, and workers reassured that their jobs were secure. Many of them had watched the events unfold with unease, uncertain how a change in ownership might affect their livelihoods. Emily made a point of meeting them, of listening rather than commanding. She understood that trust would not be automatic. It would have to be earned through consistency and fairness. When the time came for Richard and Evelyn to leave the main house, Emily made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She informed them that they could remain on the property, but only in the small house at the edge of the land. It was the same house they had given her when she had been most vulnerable, the same place they had assumed would quietly erase her presence. Now it was the only option she offered. The reaction was immediate and severe. The humiliation of the proposal cut deeper than eviction alone. For Richard, the idea of living in a place he had deliberately assigned as punishment was unbearable. For Evelyn, it represented a public acknowledgement of their fall from authority. Yet circumstances left them with little choice. Their resources had been depleted by legal fees and failed attempts to reverse the ruling. Pride resisted, but necessity prevailed. Emily did not frame the decision as revenge, though others interpreted it that way. To her, it was symmetry. It was an opportunity for them to experience, in a limited but undeniable way, the consequences of what they had done. She did not interfere with their move or dictate how they should live. The conditions were the same ones she had endured. Nothing more, nothing less. Time moved forward, as it always does. Emily grew into her role as owner and manager of the ranch. The learning curve was steep, but she approached it with patience and diligence. She sought advice when needed, invested in improvements, and implemented fair labor practices that gradually transformed the atmosphere of the operation. Productivity increased, but more importantly, stability took root. The ranch became known not just for its output, but for the way it was run. Liam grew alongside it. The uncertainty of his early years gave way to routine and confidence. He learned the land not as a symbol of power, but as a place of work and responsibility. Emily spoke openly with him as he grew older, explaining what had happened in terms he could understand, emphasizing truth rather than resentment. She wanted him to inherit not bitterness, but clarity. Richard and Evelyn lived quietly in the small house. At first, resentment defined their days. They avoided interaction, clinging to their sense of injustice. But time has a way of eroding certainty, especially when it is built on pride. Living with reduced comfort and status forced reflection they had never allowed themselves before. They saw the ranch continue without them, saw Emily succeed where they had assumed she would fail, and slowly, unwillingly, began to recognize their misjudgment. Years passed before the first real change occurred. Liam, older now, curious and unburdened by old grudges, wandered toward the edge of the property and began speaking with Richard. What started as occasional conversation grew into regular visits. Stories were shared, not of conflict, but of the past, of Nathan's childhood, of the land as it once was. Emily observed this from a distance, uncertain but attentive. Eventually, Richard sought her out. Age and circumstance had softened him, stripping away much of the certainty that once defined his authority. He acknowledged what he had done without excuse, recognizing the harm caused not only to Emily, but to his own grandson. The admission did not erase the past, but it altered its shape. Emily listened without interruption, understanding that accountability, even delayed, mattered. Forgiveness did not come immediately, but when it did, it was deliberate. Emily had learned that holding on to anger only prolonged suffering. She forgave not to absolve, but to release herself from the weight of resentment. Yet forgiveness did not mean forgetting. The boundaries she had established remained intact, shaped by experience rather than vengeance. As Richard and Evelyn aged, the limitations of the small house became increasingly apparent. Their health declined, and daily tasks grew more difficult. Emily watched this progression carefully, aware of the decision she would eventually have to make. When the time came, she offered them a modest guest house closer to the main residence, one that allowed them comfort without restoring the status they had once held. The move marked a quiet reconciliation. They did not return to the main house, but they were no longer isolated. Meals were occasionally shared. Liam maintained his relationship with them, guided by Emily's example of balance rather than extremes. The ranch became not just a place of business, but a landscape of hard-earned coexistence. When Richard and Evelyn passed away within months of each other, their deaths were peaceful. Emily arranged their burial alongside Nathan, recognizing that despite everything, they were bound by family. It was not an act of obligation, but of closure. Years later, Liam returned from his studies, prepared to take on greater responsibility. Emily gradually transferred authority to him, confident in his understanding of both the land and the history that shaped it. Together, they preserved the small house at the edge of the property, restoring it not as a dwelling, but as a reminder. Inside, the story was documented fully, without embellishment or omission. Emily often returned there alone, standing in the quiet space where everything had changed. It reminded her not of suffering, but of resilience, of the truth that had waited patiently beneath the floor, and of the choice she had made to uncover it. From that place, she could look back across the land and know with certainty that justice had not only been claimed, but lived. If this story resonates with you, stay with us until the end and explore our other videos as well. Each one carries its own lesson and meaning. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this video with others. Your support helps these stories reach more people and keeps this channel alive.